What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive into some more brews that I've come up with the release of the Forgotten Realms here on MTG Arena. These are a couple different brews that I didn't really put a budget into these. These are all just kind of like what I felt like worked together. Some of them are some decks that you may have seen me kind of already play in budget form. Some of these decks are kind of brand new just based on, what I've been kind of feeling out, kind of seeing what could be done, what cannot be done. Overall, just, getting a little bit of variety when it comes to playing various styles of Magic. With that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to know when I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. Puts a +1/+1 counter on the channel, which definitely helps out a lot. But that being said, let's just dive into the video and let's just talk about it. So this first deck up is a Gruul deck that I am calling Oops All Legends. Essentially what this deck consists of are all legendary creatures. We are playing one of the new cards from from Forgotten Realms. We are playing the Bard class. Essentially it's a 2-mana enchantment that is a red and a green, and whenever legendary creatures that we enter the battlefield under our control, they enter with additional +1/+1 counter on it, so they're already coming out bigger than they already are. For 2 mana, a red and a green, we can actually make our legendary spells cost one red less and 1 green less to cast. This effect reduces only the amount of color mana you pay, so they still cost the colorless mana if that still exists. And for 5 mana, we can, whenever we cast a legendary spell, we exile top 2 cards of our library. We may play them this turn. So if we have the mana available, we can play those cards from that we reveal from the top of our library. So essentially what we're trying to do here is we're essentially just playing this pile of legendary creatures, and we're just trying to play them for as cheap as possible and kind of overwhelm our opponent with these various legendary creatures. These are all rotation proof creatures. They're all from Zendikar Rising and forward, all bringing something a little bit unique to the table to kind of help us ramp up and help us take advantage of our opponent. It's pretty straightforward. It's actually kind of fun when you do actually start going off. I would recommend, if you actually are playing this deck, that if you have a Bard class in your opening hand, hopefully at least 2 other mana, a red and a green, and a little, maybe additional, I would say 3 mana at least. It's a pretty ideal hand. You also want to probably draw your lower end of the curve, but overall you can do pretty decent if you at least draw your 3 drops and maybe a couple, draw a pretty decent curve overall. Other than that, the deck is a fun one. It is a little bit on the pricey side because we are playing legends. Most of them are mythics, if not legendaries, as are mythics and rares as well. So it is a little bit costly if this is something you're looking to build. This is something you definitely work towards. But like I said, it's a fun deck that is kind of like, what can we do, using the new class, Bard class, to kind of make this deck work. The deck list consistent of, we have Magda, the Brazen Outlaw. She's kind of in here because whenever she becomes tapped, or another dwarf becomes tapped, I think she's the only dwarf in the deck. We get some treasure tokens. We can sacrifice the treasure tokens. We can search our library for an artifact or dragon card, put that card into the battlefield and shuffle. She's just kind of in here for a little bit of ramp, just an early 2-drop, maybe to get a sort of threat or kind of get that removal out of the way pretty early. Other than that, it's just a pretty decent flavor just to kind of have for the most part. She's not necessary to have in the deck, but I just figured I'd throw her in here just to kind of test it out and see how it works. Of course, we got the 4 copies of the Bard class because, like I said, this is actually one of the key cards that really help this deck pop off. Even if you, just play this and maybe have a couple other legendaries in your hand, I do think the first 2 levels, the initial level plus the second level, really make this card that much better because you are making some of your cards in your deck just cost colorless mana, which makes it easier to play, especially if your mana is not drawn perfectly. There is no dual land outside of the pathways really to fix your mana. We didn't get any snarls from Strixhaven to kind of fix red and green together, so we are out of a disadvantage there. I mean, you can throw Evolving Wilds in the deck, but at the same time too, it's like you don't want to throw them in because those lands come to the battlefield tap. But you can always mess around and kind of figure out that mana, depending on how you feel like you want to shift it around when it comes to that. Then we also have Targnar, the Demon Fang Null. It's a 2 mana 2/2 Null, red and a green. So essentially, after we play our Bard class, if we get to level 2 at least, he's essentially free for a 2/2, and has the pack tactics. Whenever we attack with a total power of 6 or greater, attacking creatures we control get +1/+0 into end of turn. And for 4 mana, we can double his power and toughness at end of turn, so we can get a little bit more aggressive against our opponent if that's something we're looking forward to do. In the 3-drop slot, we have Arnie, Broken Bow, 3 mana 3/3 with haste. It has boast of 1. We may change his power and toughness to 1 plus the greatest power among creatures we control. There's some creatures in our deck that can get pretty big pretty quickly, so he can grow pretty decent in size. Just a pretty decent overall 3-drop that can attacking aggressively, especially if we want to kind of finish our opponent off in 3 minutes, not too bad. And, with the Bard class, it'll just cost 2 colorless, which is pretty good as well. Then we have Bergie in here, God of Storytelling. It's an interesting card. Just on the idea here, I do kind of like the idea that whenever we play, whenever we cast a spell, we get to add red mana. So if we do actually have like a Targnar coming battlefield free, we get a free red mana out of it. And then creatures we control can boast twice during each of our turns rather than once. I feel like it plays pretty well with like Arnie, for example. So definitely a cool kind of thing I'm kind of messing around with, kind of seeing how that actually interaction works. I haven't yet to pull it off, but if I do, I'll let you know in some sort of updated video at some point. And then the card after that, we have Isika, God of the Tree, 3 mana, 1/4 Vigilance, add 1 mana of any color, and then other legendary creatures we control have Vigilance and also can add 1 mana of any color. And she has the Prismatic Bridge, which is on the flip side. At the end of our upkeep, we reveal cards of our library until we reveal a creature or planeswalker card, put that card onto the battlefield, and the rest on the bottom of our library in any random order. Essentially, Isika is here more so to give our creatures the ability to attack in with Vigilance, which is pretty strong. And then if we really want to, we draw another Isika. We can always try to play the Prismatic Bridge later in the game, but having that mana ramp is actually pretty good because after playing her, if you have creatures out before her, those creatures now can tap down for mana, maybe play additional legendary creatures, which overall works pretty well. Then we have Varus, Silvery Moon Ranger, 3 mana, 3/3, reach with board. When we cast a creature or planeswalker spell, we venture into a dungeon. This ability triggers only once each turn. Whenever we complete a dungeon, we create a 2/2 green wolf token on the battlefield. And I do think this is pretty decent just because it kind of helps us venturing in the dungeon. We're not super heavy into it, but just having that ability available is pretty decent in that sense because we can get things to draw cards, fix the top of our library by scrying, pick one of the various dungeons, and it has reach, so it kind of helps us in the air as we don't have too much in the way of removal. We are trying to just be very aggressive with our very powerful creatures that just have very, very powerful effects. So it is pretty decent for us to be able to fix our deck based on what we scry. Then in the 4-drop slot, we jump from 3 to 4. We have Toralf, God of Fury. It's a 4 mana 5/4 with trample, and whenever a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls is dealt excess non-combat damage, it deals damage equal to that excess to any other target than that permanent. So essentially, if we were able to shock it, which we're not really doing here, but if we had his hammer out on the battlefield, that excess damage the hammer would go to some other target and or another player, which is pretty decent. And like I said, he is also an equipment if we want to play it. Equipped creature has 2 mana, a colorless and a red. We unattach it, deal 3 damage to any target, and then we return it back to our hand. An equipped creature gets +3/+0 as long as it's legendary, and essentially all our cards in our deck are legendary, and we equip it for 2 mana. So he does have that universality, this double effect too. If we have him on the battlefield, then we draw him again, we can always play him as a hammer, make him one of our other creatures that much stronger, which is definitely pretty good. And just throwing a hammer at our opponent's face if they're pretty low is also a pretty decent way to finish off the game. Other than that, the card's a pretty decent card. Like I said, we're not taking advantage of us doing excess damage to creatures, but it's a decent effect to have just in case. Then, of course, because we are playing green, I do think Toski actually is pretty decent in this slot here. It's a 4 mana 1/1 with indestructible. It can't be countered, and whenever it has to attack each combat if able. And then whenever creatures we control deal combat damage to a player, we have to draw a card. So essentially, this is one of our mechanics in the deck for us to kind of refill our hand back up after maybe playing a bunch of legendaries prior to it. But overall, pretty decent card here. And this combined with Bard class makes it a little bit more of a threat than just a 1/1. They can easily chump. Now it's a 2/2, so it's definitely something that could, have to be blocked after a certain point. They can only take so many hits before, their life total gets a little bit low. Then we have Kolvori, God of Kinship. It's a 4 mana 2/4. As long as we control 3 or more legendary creatures, it gets +4/+2 and has Vigilance. And for 2 mana, we can look at the top 6 cards of our library, reveal a legendary card from among them, put it into our hand, put the rest on the bottom of our library in any random order. So the one benefit here is if it has its +4/+2 and Vigilance, we can attack in, wait, let our opponent then go, and then wait through the end of their turn, tap it, and then look for another legendary to add back to our hand, maybe to play it on the following turn. And the other thing too, it has a little bit of ramp on the other side. It's a green and a colorless. It enters the battlefield, we get to choose a creature type. We get to add green mana, spend this mana only cast creature spells of the chosen type or a legendary creature spell, which our deck is full of. So essentially this helps us ramp up a little bit for 2 mana, which isn't too terrible. The creature type really doesn't matter since all our creatures are legendary. Then we're messing around with Ashaya, Soul of the Wild. It's a 5-mana star. Essentially, its power and toughness are equal to the number of lands we control. And non-token creatures we control are forest lands in addition to their other types. They are still affected by summon and sickness. So this is actually pretty interesting, just to throw it out there. I actually had this in when I was doing some playtesting with this deck. You know, if you have a creature that now becomes a land, and your opponent decides to place a spell that has destroy target non-land permanent, they actually can't, because now your creatures are considered lands. And now they can't actually, you know, be destroyed by spells that would destroy non-land permanents, or be targeted by things that are non-land permanents as long as they're out on the battlefield, which is definitely pretty interesting. I wasn't expecting that interaction. I think the opponent I was playing Bind In, and they didn't realize, and they tried to target something, and then it just fizzled because they couldn't target anything because all of my creatures on the battlefield were lands. So definitely interesting interaction, and also because our creatures are also lands on top of our lands. It comes out and it's even bigger. So overall, pretty decent card to kind of have in here for that little bit of that weird kind of synergy, how it has making our things lands on top of making our us be able to produce a little bit more mana. Then in the top end of the deck, in the 6 and 7 drop slot, we have Morag, Fury of Okwam. It's a 6-mana 6/6. Each creature we control gets +1/+0 for each time it has attacked this turn, and it has a landfall ability that whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, if it's your main phase, there's an additional combat phase after this phase, and then at the beginning of our combat, untap all creatures we control. So essentially, what we could do if we have this if we play this and we play our land and we do our thing for the turn, we have something like Asika, God of the Tree, and we start tapping our creatures for mana. We can actually then go to combat. All our creatures now untap after we use them as mana, and then we go into our additional combats if we played a land for the turn. So overall, pretty interesting card that kind of synergizes pretty well with the deck overall. And usually when our opponent sees this and we play a land, our opponent usually then at that point scoops. Also, another interesting interaction, you have a Shaya out and then follow up with this. This counts as a land, therefore triggering landfall because it somehow happens at the same time as it enter in play. So pretty interesting interaction. You can get a trigger right off of playing creatures that are becoming lands from Ashaya. So just to kind of throw it out there as another interaction that kind of synergizes pretty well with this landfall trigger. And then of course, because we're playing green, why not have something that's legendary and can fly in the air and play a dragon, one of the new dragons. We got all No Bone. It's a 7-mana 7/7. Whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, create that many treasure tokens. And because we're playing some pretty decent sized things, swinging in at our opponent and doing damage, and maybe they won't block it, or it's just too much for them to block. We'll get a bunch of treasure, and then we can continue playing more spells, which just then overwhelms our opponent with a bunch of things. Now, the one downfall to the deck, because the deck plays mostly legendary creatures, it does stink that sometimes we do end up drawing multiple copies of creatures. But worst case scenario, what you may have to do is just kind of hold them in your hand, kind of see if your opponent's going to interact with anything on the board, and go from there. But overall, it's a pretty fun deck. It is, like I said, on the expensive side because most of the cards in the deck are mythics and or rares. A couple uncommons, but like I said, the rest of it is not. So overall, pretty expensive deck for maybe someone who may already have a bunch of these cards, or someone who's looking to spend some wild cards on maybe just a fun deck just full of a bunch of like very effective, very strong cards. So the next deck up on the list is this Azban control style token deck that I kind of put together. Essentially, it's kind of playing pretty aggressively in the early game removal, kind of keeping your opponent's board pretty clear. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to do a bunch of different things in the deck to kind of slow down our opponent. The one thing I would say that I actually did, that we'll kind of go over kind of while I go through the deck, is I kind of like, there's not really too much in the way of land destruction unless you physically play a land destruction spell. So I am playing a card in the deck that kind of tries to counter some of the decks that are playing like creature lands, because there isn't really too much to really stop that creature land from becoming a creature and swinging in and hitting you, let alone there's a mono white combo if you haven't played against it that makes the changeling land from call time into activates it, puts a counter on it, then essentially that land now can't win. That land now has this counter that makes so your opponent can't win or lose the game. So essentially we are playing a card that kind of counters that. But overall the deck is playing pretty control heavy. We are playing a bunch of removal, as you can kind of see here. Our removal is, for the most part, it's a bunch of board wipes, a bunch of direct kill spells. We are splashing green and white in the deck just to kind of overall, hopefully slow our opponent down. At some point, I did have more like white spells in the deck, but I kind of cut them down because it just didn't feel like it was synergizing very well. So overall, the deck is pretty removal heavy. So if in a control matchup, it's not the greatest, but we do have ways to kind of hopefully overwhelm our opponent in that situation. So in the 1-drop slot, we are playing Bloodchief's Thirst. This is 2 copies. That's where I kind of felt like it's settled, because in certain situations it's great, in some situations it's not the removal you want to draw. So I figured just to keep it pretty balanced and keep it at 60 cards, I've just played 2 copies. In the 2-drop slot, we are playing the Grim Wanderer. It's a pretty interesting spell that I actually I overlooked when I initially built in this deck, but it's pretty cool. It has flash. It's a 2-mana 5/3, but it has a thing called Tragic Backstory, and it can only be casted if a creature has died this turn. So it kind of synergizes very well with us being very removal heavy, that we can actually remove something either on our side and or opponent's side, and then play it for 2 mana, which makes it pretty decent. Just playing 2 copies of, because we're playing a little bit more on the control side, not really playing it on this being one of our win cons. So overall, it's kind of one of those things that we are kind of just playing a couple of. So this is the card I was talking about. This is kind of like our way to hopefully slow down our opponent from playing lands that become creatures. It's Lithoform Blight. It's a 2-mana enchant land. When it enters the battlefield, we get to draw a card. Enchanted land loses all land types and abilities, but has tap, add a colorless, and tap, add pay 1 life, and add 1 mana of any color. So what this enchantment is trying to do is actually enchant these creature lands to lose the ability to become creatures, and it gives them this effect instead. So that's kind of like the one thing that is pretty interesting about this land. So overall, pretty interesting in that sense, is us trying to counter that people trying to change creatures into lands, also because they added a whole bunch of creature lands as well. This is kind of one of our ways to hopefully combat that. We are playing 3 copies of Power Word Kill. There are dragons, and occasionally you do run into Is It Dragons, and this card becomes pretty not effective just because it can't target dragons. But overall, for 2 mana, it's a pretty strong removal spell at instant speed. So outside of that, if you're not playing that particular deck that plays a dragon, you can pretty much remove most of the other creatures that a lot of people are playing currently in the standard meta for the most part. So overall, pretty decent removal spell for 2 mana. Then we have 3 copies of Soul Shatter, just another removal spell, just because it's going on that train of let's just have enough removal. This one's actually pretty interesting because each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker with the highest mana value among those creatures and planeswalkers they control. So essentially, you play this, they play a planeswalker or a creature, you just destroy their most expensive card out of all those. Then we also have 2 copies of Baleful Mastery. It's a 4-mana instant. We can pay 2 rather than pay its mana cost. If 2 was paid, an opponent draws a card, and we get to exile a target creature or planeswalker. Yet again, just being super heavy into let's just get rid of things that our opponent's playing on the board, keep it clean, so hopefully we're not losing pretty quickly. Then we have Seeka's Chariot. It's a 4-mana 4/4. If you haven't seen this from many of the other decks that were from standard before the release of Forgotten Realms, it's just a pretty strong artifact that enters the battlefield. We create 2/2/2 green cat creature tokens, and whenever it attacks, we get to create a copy of target token we control, and we can tap 2 things that have power 4. We can tap multiple things as long as it goes over power 4. This becomes a creature we can swing in with it and hit our opponent in the face with it. Then we have Binding of the Old Gods. It's another, destruction spell and also a little bit of a ramp spell. Destroy target non-land permanent opponent controls. Search your library for a forest card, put out the battlefield tapped, and shuffle. And the creatures we control gain Death Touch until end of turn. So just an overall, just a little bit of a removal, a little bit of ramp, a little bit helping us out to hopefully fix our mana in case we aren't drawing the green mana or, that in that sense. Then we are also playing Doomscar. It's kind of interesting here just because I do think with not losing Extinction Event, there isn't too much in the way of removal that could help us out. I do think I could probably play like Creep and Chill or something like that, but I don't know if -3/-3 to everything on the board is as effective. But I just figured we can foretell this. If we get the white out, we can just wipe the board and do that way. We can also think about Blood on the Snow, but I just think it's a little expensive. There's just a possibility that this can actually be a little bit cheaper, but it's one of those things that you can always play around with and kind of figure out which board wipe you want to kind of fill this slot with, and maybe get a little bit more expensive, or just play more copies of Shadow's Verdict. But like I said, it's kind of what I'm messing with now, and it could change as I kind of play more and maybe play this a little bit more in rank, kind of see what I'm playing up against and see what I need more of to kind of combat the meta. Then we have Lola the Spider Queen. It's the new planeswalker from Forgotten Realms. It's a planeswalker that whenever a creature we control dies, we get to put a loyalty counter on Lola Spider Queen. For 0 mana, for 0 loyalty, we can draw a card and we lose a life. For -3, we can create 2/2/1 black spider creature tokens with Menace and Reach. And then for -8, we get an emblem with whenever an opponent is dealt damage by 1 or more of your creatures we control. If that player lost less than 8 life this turn, they lose life equal to the difference. So essentially, if our opponent got dealt 1 damage, they'll lose 7 more life at the end of their turn. So it's just kind of sucking the life away from from them much faster. So overall, pretty interesting card here. It's kind of like part of our win con, because the idea how we win outside of maybe our 5-3 is creating a bunch of tokens that just overwhelms our opponent that way. And it's kind of cool. This is kind of like the new Garrick, since the Golgari Garrick is rotating out. This is kind of the spell that has creatures that put loyalty counters when they die, not just the spiders but any creatures that we can do control. So overall, pretty cool card. Then, of course, like I said, we are playing Shadow's Verdict, just because if you are playing against the more aggressive decks that are playing a lot lower to the ground or a lot lower of a curve, Shadow's Verdict is just a very strong removal. It exiles all creatures and planeswalkers with mana value 3 or less from the battlefield, and all creatures and planeswalkers with cards mana value or 3 or less from all graveyards, so they can't reoccur any other creatures from the graveyards, though I don't think there's too many in the way of things that can do that, but it's a pretty decent board wipe that kind of just stops a lot of the more aggressive, cheaper decks. Then on top of it, we are playing Froghemoth. It's a 5-mana 4/4 trample haster. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we exile that many cards from that player graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on it for each creature exiled this way, and we gain 1 life for each non-creature exiled this way. So overall, it's a pretty decent card. It's kind of like the new, the new skews. It's the new ooze kind of creature, Scavenging Ooze. So it does have to attack to do the effect, but if it does do damage, we can start just chomping away at things. If we need the life, we gain the life. If we want to make it bigger and then chomp at more things the following turn, we can do that as well. Just overall pretty decent frog horror creature that just eats graveyards. And then this is actually like the win condition. This is Skeletal Swarming. If you haven't seen it, I do think it's a pretty strong card, especially in these like slower control decks where it's looking for a win con. And I do think it's kind of like the Sharknado of this style of control. It's essentially each skeleton we control has trample, attacks each turn if able, and gets X+X+0, where X is the number of skeletons we control. And at the beginning of our end step, create a tap 1/1 skeleton creature equal token. If a creature has died this turn, we get to create 2 of those tokens instead. So with us playing heavy removal, it doesn't limit it to just our creatures. It's if any creature has died at the end of our turn, we can actually get that double effect. So what we could do is we can do a spot removal spell, maybe to get in through for some damage during combat, and at the end of our turn we'll then get 2 more skeletons to kind of ramp up our skeleton damage. And this is one of those things, like if our opponent doesn't really deal with this card and we're able to get skeletons on the board without them really being able to remove them by blocking and whatnot, our skeletons will eventually grow pretty large and pretty wide that they're not going to be able to handle the width and the strength of these skeletons that will just swing in and probably for lethal. On top of that, the skeletons have trample, so the bigger they get, the more trample damage that could get through, especially if they play smaller creatures. So overall, it's a pretty interesting card. I do really like it in this deck. When you do get it out, it's one of those things that, like I said, sometimes your opponent just scoops just because you see this card and they're like, I have nothing to do that can combat this, and your board's already decent, and this is just gonna throw it over the top. But overall, pretty cool card. Then the mana base is kind of interesting here. We are playing 2 plains. We're playing 1 swamp, 3 forests, 2 of the blight climbs, 2 of the snarls, 4 of the campuses, 2 pathways, 2 of the green-black snarls, 4 of the green-black campuses, 1 world tree as an interesting thing to kind of help us fix our mana. Just because, like I said, with this set coming out, we kind of lost triomes, and I do think to kind of fix the mana, maybe having a 1 of these, we're not really using the sacrifice effect, but just to help us, have our mana produce any color depending on how we need it. For the most part, there isn't a lot of things that are double of a color, except in a more expensive slot. The earlier the game is like 1 of, if not, it's 1 of each color. But for the most, like I said, it's just to help us kind of have that additional filter. And of course, Evolving Wilds, as it's our only fetch style land in this whole meta that's currently happening, as this is a rotation proof deck. This is the only way we can fix our mana if we aren't drawing any of our other cards to kind of do it that way. But overall, like I said, it's a fun deck. It's, if you're looking for something a little bit on the control side, but maybe like more of that, like, removal heavy style, this could be the deck for you. You could always tweak things, like I said, when it comes to the actual board wipes. If you want to play Blood on the Snow and maybe just not play any white and just go straight green and black, that's, you're cool doing that, playing some more Golgari. It's just like, it's one of those things that as we kind of, see where the meta develops, I do think maybe there's more cards in white that could be added to the deck. But overall, it's a good start. I do think, with it especially being very early into the set and people are still tinkering and kind of figuring out what they like and what they don't like. Now, this next deck you probably are already looking at, and you're like, why does this deck seem very familiar? And it's super familiar. It's Dimir Rogues. It's not as crazy as it currently is in, like, if you play in the normal standard. But for the most part, it's actually pretty interesting in how decent it's held up, and it's actually interesting in what this version of the deck is trying to do, and how I'm kind of like building around. So you know how like Rogues kind of mills and you get effects if your opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. Well, the new Rogue class is kind of the interesting card in the deck, and this is a 2-mana enchantment that your Rogue class. Whenever creatures we control deals damage to a player, exile a top card of that player's library face down, and we look at it as long as it remains exiled. So essentially, in the scheme of everything, it'll just get tucked underneath this, and you can kind of just like look at it, see what cards you're kind of putting underneath this. So that's the initial level 1 ability. Level 2, we get for 3 mana, creatures now we control have menace, so given all our rogues menace, which makes them a little bit more threatening because now it makes it awkward for our opponent to block. And for 4 mana, we can actually play the exiled cards underneath the rogue class, and we spend mana as though it was mana any color to cast those spells. So nothing's worse than playing your opponent and then playing their own spells against them to beat them. And at that point, usually a lot of people start scooping, especially when their spells are being played against them. That's kind of slowing them down from doing their own thing that they're trying to do with their own spells. It's kind of a cool mechanic, and I do think it puts rogues in more of that weird, like, I'm kind of using your own tools and tricks against you kind of thing. But overall, like, the deck hasn't lost too much other than maybe some of the cards that kind of helped it kind of, mill a lot quicker. So the mill is a little bit slower. But in the 1-drop slot, we are playing 4 of the Merfolk Wind Robbers. It's a 1-mana, 1/1 flyer with the ability that whenever it deals damage, that player mills a card. We can sacrifice it. That player has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. We're also playing 3 copies of Blood Chief's Thirst as a spot removal. It's pretty decent early game, especially against cheaper decks. And, it can be effective in the late game if we want to kick it and get that additional, destroy any creature or planeswalker. Then we are playing 2 copies of the Guild Thief. It's a new card from Forgotten Realms. It's whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we have to put a +1/+1 counter on it. And for 4 mana, we can actually make it unblockable this turn. Definitely pretty cool. If our opponent doesn't really deal with it, it can actually go pretty decently big. We also have other ways to make it harder for our opponent to block this for cheaper. So overall, just a pretty decent card that becomes a decent threat and as the game goes on. Then we have Yuan-Ti Malison. It's a 2-mana, 2/1 rogue. It can't be blocked. It can't be blocked as long as it's attacking alone. So if you're in the early game on turn 2 or turn 3, I guess, you swing in, as long as it's the only creature, it can actually get in for free damage. And the other thing too is whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we venture into a dungeon, which kind of just helps us up. I mean, we're not super heavy into venture, but it's just a perk because you get different effects that kind of help us, maybe fix the top of our card of the library if we want to go heavy into maybe that, the one that like does damage if you don't discard cards and pings each player kind of life. Depending on what the situation of the game is, you can always, just venture and kind of do things depending on the situation of how you feel like the game's going. Then with the Acquisitions Experts, a 2-mana 1/2. When it enters the battlefield, the target opponent reveals any number of cards equal to the number of creatures in our party. We choose one of those cards, that player discards that card. So just a little bit of, hand destruction. That's what we're only playing two of. We're not really playing the party mechanics, so we don't need a bunch of other, creature types. But it's just a pretty interesting card to have in the deck, just to have the possibility of just, hitting the hand, making them make tough decisions on maybe if they have really good cards in their hand, which ones they have to get rid of. Then we have 4 copies of the Lightfoot Rogue, yet again another card from Forgotten Realms. It has an ability called Sneak Attack. Whenever it attacks, we get to roll a d20. 1 through 9, it gains Death Touch. 10 through 19, it gains +1/+0 in Death Touch. And 20, it gains +3/+0 First Strike and Death Touch on the turn. Just an overall pretty decent rogue that attacks him pretty aggressively. And especially, you've been in the situation, you never want to block your creature with Death Touch, especially in the early game, especially when it's only a 2/1. But, it makes our opponent have to make tough blocks in the later game, especially, as it's done more damage to their face, with the possibility of even doing more damage if we roll pretty high. Then we're also playing 3 copies of the Power Word Kill. Just like in my other decks that are Splash and Black, this is something that is interesting. If you do get teamed up against angels, demons, non-devils, or dragons, it can hit it. If those are those 4 creature types, it can't. So I haven't been playing that many games against decks that are playing strictly those creature types, but overall it's a good card for 2 mana. I can't say any more about it. Then we have Crydal of Baldur's Gate. It's a 2-mana 1/3, a blue and a black. When it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses 1 life, mills a card, and then we gain 1 life and we scry. So has a good way to fix in our top card of our library, milling our opponent and whatnot. And then on top of it, whenever we attack, we can pay 2. If we do, target creature we control can't be blocked this turn. So essentially, for 2 mana, we can give target creature unblockable until end of turn, which is also very good. So, and it doesn't have to attack in order for this trigger to happen. So you can actually attack with any of our other creatures and give it that sort of unblockable. Now, we kind of went over the rogue class, but overall it's a pretty strong mechanic, especially with this unblockable and us doing damage to our opponent and just getting access to their library. And not on top of it, also milling them, and also then milling them with exiling cards under this. So overall, pretty good card to kind of, you know, utilize both mechanics of the rogues that we currently have. Then, of course, because we are playing rogues, we are playing Sword and Thought Thief. It's a 2-mana, 1/3 rogue, flash with flyer. As long as our opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, rogues we get +1/+0. And then whenever one of our rogues we control attacks, each opponent mills 2 cards. So overall, just a pretty decent mill mechanic. Then next card up on the list is Black Bloom Rogue. It's a 3-mana 2/3 with Menace. It gets +3/+0 as long as an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, and we can also use it as a tap land if we need to get that mana. It's kind of one of those things. That's why it's a 2 of. We don't really need it in the deck to make it work, but it's just kind of one of those things. If we need the black mana, we can have that as a possibility, and if we want to attack and aggressively, if our opponent's graveyard is pretty full, we can play that as well. Then the last creature I believe in the deck is Nighthawk Scavenger. It's a 3-mana with the flying, death touch, lifelink, and its power is equal to 1 plus the number of card types among cards in your opponent's graveyards. Cards in graveyards only have characters of their front face, so it doesn't count modal lands and modal spells and things like that. But essentially, it's a pretty strong blocker / attacker because of the lifelink and the death touch and the flying. Just an overall pretty decent rogue that kind of just fits pretty well with the deck overall. And for our big board wipe presence that we're trying to use in case our opponent's trying to get the board pretty wide, it's like if they're playing like goblins or something like that, or just trying to get very wide in general, we are playing Cripple and Fear. It's a 4-mana board wipe essentially for smaller things. We choose a creature type. Creatures of that type that aren't that type get -3/-3 until the turn. Pretty much essentially wiping out a lot of, you know, your more tribal style decks like goblins, elves, more aggro style decks as well. And overall, pretty decent card because all our creatures are rogues. We are playing Rogue Tribal. It's a pretty decent board wipe nonetheless. Just like kind of like the other decks that didn't get any snarls, we kind of are limited on what lands we can play. So we are playing 9 islands, 9 swamps, and 4 of the Murkwater / Clearwater pathways. I was thinking about playing some of the tap lanes, but I do think this is one of those decks where, you know, we can settle in at like that 4 to 5 mana slot for how much lands we need. But at the same time, too, we don't need to have a bunch of lands. I do think the deck draws pretty decent when it comes to actually drawing blue and or black mana when we do need it. So overall, it's a pretty decent, you know, mana assortment. And you're like wondering yourself, well, there's only 22 lands, but we are, like I said, we are playing the Black Bloom Rogue, so we do have, you know, a land just in case. But overall, pretty decent, you know, deck to kind of mess with that little bit of like that aggro-y kind of reactive style rogue / a little bit of control, I guess, depending on how you want to angle it. But overall, it's a pretty fun deck to kind of, if you still want to play some sort of rogues, if rogues was your deck prior to, you know, rotation, or you know, prior to the 2022 queue, if you wanted to play that queue but play rogues in that queue, this is a pretty decent list to maybe get started with and maybe make your own tweaks depending on what you like and what you don't like. And our last deck up on the list is another deck that this is a deck I kind of made a budget version of, but I didn't include a lot of the cards in this deck that I did in the budget version, and that is It Copy. And I'm calling it Is It Copy instead of Is It Roll, just because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to just do a lot of like stupid stuff with the deck. We are playing cards that help us, you know, fix our rolls so we can roll more and do more damage. We are playing Barbarian class, which is a pretty strong card, just on the idea that it has a win condition that helps us out with one of our win conditions, with the level 2 ability. But the first ability, just playing it, just gives us additional dice roll. We roll that many dice and ignore the lowest roll, it's definitely already a pretty good card. We are also playing Frostbite as a spot removal, as we are playing Snow Lands. We have Pixie Guide in here as another card, way to give us an advantage when it comes to dice rolls, allowing us to roll that many dice +1. We have Expressive Iteration for that, you know, little bit of card draw. We can draw the card that we want into our hand, throw a card back we don't want into our library, and then hopefully maybe, you know, put the land or something into our exile that we can possibly play that turn. So a pretty decent card. We're playing Solid Comment in here, just maybe slow down our opponent. For some reason, when I actually play tested this deck, I got paired a lot against someone literally playing the same exact deck. I don't know if it was like the same exact cards, but someone had the same idea. And I just kind of felt like maybe having some disruption maybe slowed their plan down so I can get my plan going was kind of good. And because we are playing blue mana, might as well play, you know, some counters to go along with it. Then with Prismari Command is more spot removal, and also we can draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. We can create a treasure token, or we can destroy target artifact, which is actually pretty funny when you destroy someone else's treasure that they may have, you know, had, so that maybe they can play a particular spell to maybe fix their mana base. It's pretty funny to watch someone be like, wait, you just destroyed my treasure for what reason? We have contact on another plane. I do think it's a pretty decent, draw spell. With us having, this bonus to our dice rolls, we do tend to more so scry 2 than draw 2, with the possibility also even scrying 3 and drawing 3. But overall, pretty decent card, I do think, at instant speed with the roll mechanic. Then with Delina, the Wild Mage. If you haven't played this card is bananas. Combine that with like Barbarian class and maybe a couple extra things that help us fix our rolls. As long as you roll a 15 or higher, you're going to re-trigger her ability over and over again every time it happens. And the thing is that's pretty crazy is as long as you have some of these out and you actually are rolling pretty decent and get like 4 or 5 of them, all of a sudden the level 2 ability of Barbarian class is already activated. As this finishes, you then get to send the +2/+0 and menace towards this, and by the time your opponent possibly has any way to kind of block it, you have like 4 or 5 different creatures that are 5 2s with menace, and our opponents maybe at 15 life because maybe you were doing other things to them, and then they just kind of scoop because there's nothing else they can do. It's just a fun kind of like thing. I know it's a completely RNG based. It doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes you can even roll like with 5+ rolls, you can somehow still roll a 1 through 14. But when it does happen and you kind of can win with just like this like Delina Wild Mage attack and just getting like 3 rolls, and all of a sudden it's like you have 4 or 5 different tokens on top of her. It's like pretty much GG's right then and there. Then, just for a little bit more other ramp in the deck, we are having Horde and Ogre. It's something that I actually added, and I kind of saw because I liked how it was playing against when I did play against some of the mirrors, and I kind of didn't think about it. It's a 4-mana 3/3, but whenever it attacks, we have to roll a d20. And essentially, if we roll, a 1 through 9, we get a treasure token. 10 through 19, we get 2 treasures, and 20, we get 3 treasures. Just having the idea that we can actually possibly get, some more treasures would help us ramp to help us play out some of our spells. I did think it was a pretty cool, kind of interaction to help us play some of our bigger spells, especially, if our opponent has some things going on, we want to disrupt that. Playing this card definitely helps with that. We are in our big slot, we are playing Wizard Spellbook just because we do play a lot of spells, so maybe having the ability to possibly replay them is definitely pretty cool. The 1 through 9 copy of that card, we can recast that copy, which is not the most ideal one. It's more the 10 through 19 is that we get the copy of that card, and we only have to pay 1, then paying that mana cost. And I do think this is where we want to hit it, playing that. And if we do get lucky and we get to 20, we then get to copy each card exiled with this, and we can cast any number of those cards without paying their mana cost. So essentially, if this has 4 or 5 different spells underneath it, we then play 4 or 5 different spells against our opponent, which at that point, they're probably more than likely going to scoop if we got that lucky, just because we do play some pretty big things that do some pretty ridiculous things. Like I said, we are playing Elemental Masterpiece as, it's a 7-mana, create 2 4/4 red-blue elemental creature tokens, and then for 2 mana, we can discard it and create a treasure token. So if we know we're going to play Spellbook, we can always discard this in the early game to try to ramp us up, and then hopefully get this underneath a Spellbook, and then maybe get some 4/4s for 1 mana, which is definitely pretty good exchange in my opinion. And then we're also playing Magma Opus, which is an 8-mana spell, divide 4 damage as we choose among any number of targets. Then we get to tap 2 target permanents, create 4/4 blue-red elemental creature token, and we get to draw 2 cards. Yet again, just like the other spell, we can discard it and create a treasure token for a little bit of that ramp if we're trying to get to that Spellbook. But overall, it's a pretty cool card when you do hit it with a Spellbook or something like that, or if we're able to ramp up with our mana and just play it straight up and outright. But overall, this is a very fun deck. Like I said, if you haven't played my budget version of the deck and you played my budget version deck, but you're looking for something maybe a little bit more expensive, this could be a version that you may want to try. Though, like I said, it's not as heavy into the dice rolls like my budget version. This one's more into let's just try to ramp up and get to our Wizard Spellbook and then try to go off from there. The mana base is pretty straightforward. We have 8 islands, 8 mountains, 4 of the snarls, and 4 of the red-blue pathways. So overall, pretty decent deck. It's just a blast to play when the counters go off. I'll be quite honest, there's more times where I'm not actually spellbooking and this just this trigger happens, and that's how I win the game. But overall, it's a fun deck just to play, especially with how I feel like the meta is a little bit all over the place. No one's really settled on what they want to play and what's good and what's not good. But overall, it's a fun deck. Now, this last deck up is an interesting one that I'm actually still in a work in progress. But essentially, I want to play all the venture cards and kind of see how the deck goes. And we're playing 4-colored venture. And it's a pretty unique deck in that sense. If you haven't played venture, venture's a new mechanic from Forgotten Realms, which essentially we go through the dungeon and certain things triggered depending on which room we choose. But overall, this is like my version of, okay, what cards can I put together that all have venture that seem pretty decent, and let's see how this deck works. And this is kind of what I've come up with. We are playing 2 copies of Fly with the ability that whenever the creature does combat damage to a player, we get the venture. So for that venture tempo, We have three copies of Young T Malison because of the Venture ability, and if it attacks alone, we do get the free Venture trigger because it's unblockable. Power word kills for that spot removal. We got Intrepid Outlander just because I do think, if we get our decent sized board, this then, gets that plus, power pack tactics trigger at 6 power or greater, and we get to venture even further. You find a cursed idol as a pretty decent situational, depending on whatever's happening. You get to destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, or create a treasure token. And venture on top of it, which is definitely pretty good for this venture mechanic. Triumphant Adventure, just because it's a very strong card. It has Death Touch, and as long as it's our turn, it has first strike, and whenever it attacks, we get to venture into a dungeon. So yet again, unless our opponent really has something that has first strike and or double strike, not many things our opponent's going to want to block with this until they really have to and put something in front of it. We have Cloister Gargoyle. It's a 3 mana 0/4. When it enters the battlefield, we get to venture, and as long as we completed a dungeon, it gets +2/+0. And we don't have to complete it while it's out in the battlefield. As long as we complete it one prior to it, it has +3/+0 and flying, which is also very good. We have Nadar, Selfless Paladin, 3 mana 3/3, Vigilance. When it enters the battlefield and or attacks, we get to venture, and as long as we completed a dungeon, all our creatures get +1/+1. So essentially it has, an Anthem style effect, which helps us out, which makes our creatures that much more threatening against our opponent. Then we have Eccentric Apprentice. This is another interesting card in here. This is something I'm not 100% sold on, but it's pretty cool in what it's trying to do. It's a 3 mana 2/2, and when it enters the battlefield, I get to venture, and at the beginning of our combat, if we completed a dungeon, we get up to one creature becomes a bird with base power and toughness of 1/1 and flying to end the turn. So this is where it's interesting. If you really need to, you can make one of your opponent's big creatures just into a bird. And it's just an awkward chump blocker. But if you want to, and you want to get through that extra point of damage, maybe your creature that has fly on it or maybe your opponent has a lot of things on the ground and it's gunked up. You can always make one of your creatures that are on the ground a flyer and swing over for 1 point of damage to maybe get a venture trigger. Just an overall pretty interesting card just to kind of get some additional venture triggers. Next card up is Varus, Silver Moon Ranger. It's a 3 mana 3/3 range and ward 1. Whenever we cast a creature or planeswalker spell, venture into a dungeon, this ability only triggers once each turn. And whenever we complete a dungeon, we get a 2/2 green wolf token out of it. Plus all the other venture triggers, this can actually pop off, and we get, we can start producing wolf tokens. Just another card that helps us with our whole venture mechanic. I do like the idea that whenever we cast, we get to venture, then triggering more ventures. So overall, pretty good card that synergizes very well. Then we are playing 2 copies of the Eliwick Tumblestrum. It's a 4 mana bard. Planeswalker has a +1 of venture into a dungeon. We can -2. We could look at the top 6. We may reveal a creature among them, put it into our hand. If it's legendary, we get 3 life. Put it the rest on the bottom of the library in any order. And for -7, we get an emblem. Creatures we control have trample and have haste and get +2/+2 for each differently named dungeon we completed. So essentially, if we somehow complete all 3 dungeons, we can have our creatures get a maximum of +6/+6. Trample and haste, and pretty much at that point we're hopefully going to win the game, just because I don't actually think most games go until you complete. Most games only go and maybe you're in your second dungeon, or even maybe finish with your second dungeon. No one ever really goes into the 3rd dungeon, especially at some point if you're trying to get the trigger. You're going through different dungeons, so you're trying to get the triggers, you're trying to get those triggers that way. But overall, pretty interesting card just to kind of help us with our venture mechanic, and I do like it that if we really need some more creatures on the battlefield, we can always -2 and do that. Then we also have Barrowwind, the Clan Under. It's a 4 mana 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, we get the venture, and whenever it attacks, we get to return up to 1 creature card with mana value 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield if we complete a dungeon. So overall, this is a card that's going to help us return the rest of the deck if our rest of our deck has somehow ended up in the graveyard if we completed a dungeon. So overall, pretty cool card that just synergizes very, very well. Now you may be thinking to yourself, well, this is crazy. There's not many lands that can help you play multiple colors, and that's actually true. So our mana base is kind of crazy looking. It's 2 ofs and 4 ofs and 1 ofs and things like that. So overall, it's an interesting mana base. But I do think in the areas where we don't have a lot of particular colors, it balances out because we have planes to hopefully balance with the other cards. So we have 3 plains. We have 1 island, 1 swamp, 2 of the forest, 2 of the blue-white pathways, 2 of the black-white pathways, 2 of the black-blue pathways, 2 of the black-green pathways, 2 of the white-green pathways, 2 of the blue-green pathways, and 2 of the world tree. And essentially the world tree, if we get this out, it helps just filter our mana so we can just play any of these lands to just play any of our spells. But overall, this is the mana base. Like I said, it looks pretty crazy. It can be pretty crazy. Sometimes you do get unlucky. But with that being said, this is the deck, and it's, like I said, a lot of these mechanics are very fun. I don't know how long the fun's going to exist or last, but you know, it is definitely a fun thing. I do enjoy these like D&D mechanics in Dungeons and Dragons and Magic the Gathering, I should say. Let me know what you guys think overall. You know, what are your thoughts so far on the set as a whole? What decks are you excited that you're playing? Are you playing any of these decks or something similar to these decks? Let me know in the comments below. But if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to know if there's new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. And until next time, I'll see you later. Just want to give a special shout out to all the channel members as you see here on the screen. Thank you for supporting the channel. If you want to become a channel member yourself, you can actually do it in 2 different ways. You either click the join button that's right next to the subscribe button, or you can click the link down in the description. It definitely helps out the channel. But until next time, I'll see you later.